In the dim recesses of American history, certain communities flicker only briefly in the archives, isolated settlements where faith, hunger, and fear forged fragile bonds against the wilderness. One such place was Coldwater Hollow, a small Baptist congregation tucked away in the shadowed valleys of eastern Tennessee. By the year 1827, it had already acquired a reputation for secrecy, though outsiders rarely ventured close enough to confirm the rumors. It was here that the widowed Reverend Nathaniel Harlow arrived with his twin daughters, Eliza and Esther, in late November. Their journey had been long and brutal, across mountain paths nearly erased by rain and wind. Yet their appearance in Coldwater Hollow was not random. Records suggest the settlement had invited Harlow to deliver a series of revival sermons, hoping to reinvigorate the stagnant faith of its 200-odd residents. What no one could have foreseen was that his daughters, not his sermons, would ignite a fire that would consume the town's fragile order. The evidence of what transpired does not come from folklore alone. The principal source is the private journal of Pastor Samuel Pratt, Coldwater Hollow's minister at the time. His notes, discovered in 1892 beneath the rotting beams of the long-abandoned church, describe the arrival of the Harlows with a level of detail bordering on obsession. Written in cramped, ink-blotted script, they portray not only the facts of their visit, but also Pratt's escalating sense of unease, an unease that history would later vindicate. According to Pratt, the trio emerged from the forest path at twilight, a spectral vision against the fog. Nathaniel Harlow was then 35, though hardship had aged him prematurely. His beard was grizzled, his eyes hollow, and his boots nearly torn apart by years of circuit preaching. He carried little more than a leather satchel, inside of which were his Bible, a handful of personal effects, and a smaller journal where he recorded spiritual reflections. But it was the children who arrested attention. Eliza and Esther, 9 years old, identical in appearance yet opposite in bearing. Eliza radiated an unsettling brightness, quick to smile, quick to speak, with the manner of a child who seemed to know too much. Esther, in contrast, lingered in silence, watching others with unblinking concentration. Villagers noticed almost immediately that she often began a sentence her sister would finish, or turned her head toward questions meant for Eliza, as though their thoughts were fused. Pratt wrote, "They carried an air not suitable for children, as though their bodies were small, but their minds bore the weight of ancient knowledge." The history of Reverend Harlow's grief is crucial to understanding his daughters. 9 years earlier, during a blizzard that sealed their mountain cabin from all aid, his wife Margaret had perished giving birth to the twins. He buried her beneath the snow, surviving those weeks alone with 2 wailing infants, praying desperately for deliverance. Such an origin left a permanent scar. He believed his daughters were a divine burden, both a punishment and a gift. "They see what others cannot," he once confided to Pratt, "and I fear it is the Lord's way of reminding me of my sins." Coldwater Hollow itself was a settlement born of desperation. Founded in 1812 by 3 families fleeing denominational strife in nearby Knoxville, it had grown into a close-knit cluster of cabins encircling a wooden church. The soil was poor, the winters harsh, and the people insular to the point of suspicion. Most residents were bound by blood or marriage, and gossip served as both weapon and currency. The Baptist doctrine they embraced was rigid, emphasizing confession and purity. Yet, as the twins would soon reveal, beneath the piety festered secrets as old as the valley itself. The Harlows' arrival coincided with evening prayer. Pratt recorded his first impressions. The father, gaunt and weary, and bore the look of one who has buried too many dreams. The children clung to him, though their eyes, those terrible eyes, searched the congregation as though already knowing what lay within our hearts. Hospitality was extended as custom dictated. That night, the Harlows shared a meal with Pratt and his wife, and it was during this simple supper amid the clatter of spoons and the dim glow of oil lamps, that the first fracture appeared. Eliza, her cheeks still flushed from travel, looked up at Mrs. Pratt and asked, "Did your roses ever recover from the sickness 3 summers past?" The spoon dropped from the woman's hand. Her roses had indeed suffered a blight exactly 3 years earlier, a detail known only to close neighbors. Pratt described the moment vividly. I felt the air thicken as if invisible hands pressed against the walls. The child smiled, and in her eyes I saw not mischief but certainty. When questioned, Eliza merely said she had dreamed of roses while walking, and knew they belonged to the prettiest garden in the county. Pratt's journal insists this was no idle guess. He felt at once exposed, as though the child's gaze stripped him bare. His entry concludes with an ominous line, "If the Lord tests us through children, then he has sent us angels of strange disposition, whether of heaven or of hell. I cannot yet discern." By the following dawn, Nathaniel Harlow confessed his daughters had endured troubling dreams. They often dreamed of the places they would visit. He said, but the visions that night had been darker than usual. Eliza emerged from their temporary quarters, her hair disheveled, yet her eyes piercing. She declared to Pratt, "Beneath the church floorboards lies a thing that should not be." Pratt's blood ran cold, for beneath the third plank from the altar he had hidden a bottle of whiskey, a weakness he dared not confess to his flock. Wrapped around it was a fragment of cloth from his deceased infant's blanket, a private token of guilt and grief. Esther, quiet as ever, stepped forward and whispered, "The cloth is blue." At that moment, the pastor collapsed into his chair, trembling. Not a soul alive could have known of his secret. And so began the unraveling of Coldwater Hollow, a process that would, in mere days, expose crimes far greater than hidden bottles or dead roses. The twins, it seemed, carried not only knowledge of the present, but also of the buried past. And the buried past in Coldwater Hollow was darker than anyone dared admit. Pastor Pratt's final note on that first day reads like prophecy. The children dream what should remain hidden. Already I feel the ground shifting beneath our feet. This valley has long been restless. Perhaps it has found its voice in these little ones. The stage was set. Coldwater Hollow's sins, carefully concealed for 16 years, were about to claw their way into the open, spoken through the mouths of 2 fragile girls who should have been too young to understand such burdens. The Reverend Nathaniel Harlow had been traveling the backwoods circuit of Appalachia for more than a decade by the time he entered Coldwater Hollow. His presence in obscure villages and nameless mountain crossings was so frequent that settlers spoke of him as a ghostly figure appearing without warning, delivering fiery sermons, then vanishing into the mist. Yet his reputation was not built solely upon his words. It was the quiet presence of his twin daughters, Eliza and Esther, that lingered most forcefully in the memory of those who encountered them. Nathaniel himself was a man shaped by grief. Born in 1792 in Virginia, he had studied briefly at a seminary in Richmond before abandoning formal education to follow itinerant preachers into the hills. He married a woman named Margaret Carver, daughter of a modest farmer in the Smoky Mountain foothills. And, by all accounts, theirs was a bond marked by rare tenderness. That tenderness came to a brutal end in the winter of 1818 when Margaret died in childbirth, leaving Nathaniel with 2 squalling infants and a snowstorm that entombed their remote cabin. The record of that winter survives in a letter he wrote to a fellow minister months later. The wind howled so that the timbers of the cabin shook. He confessed, "I laid her body in the frozen earth while the babes cried against my breast." For 3 weeks no soul reached us. I could not pray aloud, only groan. I believed the Lord had struck me for my sins, and yet he left me with 2 living burdens, as if to say, "Bear them," and bear the memory of her death with them, That sense of punishment never left him. The twins, in his mind, were both a proof of God's sovereignty and reminders of his inadequacy. It was said he often looked at them not with pride, but with a mixture of reverence and dread, as though they carried within them a piece of the storm that had taken their mother. Despite such burdens, Nathaniel became known across the Cumberland foothills for his ability to stir faltering congregations. He possessed a gaunt, almost skeletal appearance, his eyes sunk deep into his face, his voice raw from years of outdoor preaching. The Journal of Pastor Pratt notes that Harlow's sermons were delivered less as exhortations and more as lamentations, as though every word sprang from wounds unhealed. People wept under his preaching, confessed sins long hidden, and spoke of renewed fervor. But behind these transformations lay whispers that the real power came not from Nathaniel at all, but from his daughters. Eliza and Esther were identical in every visible way, pale, slender, with eyes of startling blue and hair the color of dry wheat. Yet their temperaments diverged so sharply that those who met them swore they were opposites, bound within a single body split in two. Eliza, born minutes earlier, carried herself with a precocious confidence. She spoke readily, smiled easily, and could charm adults into confiding matters they had sworn never to reveal. Esther, by contrast, rarely spoke unless prompted. She lingered in corners, her gaze fixed on people with a depth that unsettled. Pratt remarked, "She looks as though she listens not to our words, but to some hidden voice beyond them." What unsettled witnesses most, however, was the strange communication between the sisters. They seemed to finish one another's sentences with perfect accuracy. At times, Esther's lips would move silently as Eliza spoke aloud. Questions directed to one were often answered by the other, as though they shared not only memory but also consciousness. It was as if, Pratt wrote, they were two windows looking upon the same secret chamber. By the time the Harlows reached Coldwater Hollow, rumors of this eerie connection had already preceded them. Accounts from other mountain churches told of children whispering private sins to the twins only to have those sins repeated in front of the entire congregation. In one town, a farmer abandoned his homestead altogether after Esther described in detail the place where he had buried a stillborn child decades before. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they had already placed the twins at the boundary between fascination and fear. The journey into Tennessee had been punishing. Heavy autumn rains turned the narrow mountain paths into rivers of mud. Nathaniel's boots were shredded from miles of walking, and Esther, prone to fevers, had to be carried the last stretch in her father's arms. Witnesses in Coldwater Hollow recalled the sight vividly, the weary preacher staggering into the settlement at dusk, one child clinging to his coat, the other pale and silent in his embrace. There was something in their entrance that unnerved the villagers. Coldwater Hollow was accustomed to travelers, yet this family seemed different. It was as if shadows walked beside them. One later wrote, as if they had brought the night into our valley. Pratt's account confirms the sense of disquiet. He described their eyes as too knowing for children and their presence as burdened with a gravity beyond their years. To understand why their presence provoked such unease, one must consider the psychology of frontier religion. Communities like Coldwater Hollow lived in constant tension, caught between wilderness and civilization, piety and desperation. The church was not merely a place of worship, it was the axis upon which the entire community turned. A preacher could inspire hope or sow division, could affirm hidden righteousness or expose buried corruption. Into this delicate balance stepped two girls who seemed capable of seeing beyond walls, beyond faces, beyond even death itself. Nathaniel, for his part, attempted to shield them. He insisted they were ordinary children, burdened with an unusual sensitivity inherited from their mother, whom he claimed possessed the second sight. Yet his attempts to minimize their strangeness often rang hollow, for the girls themselves did little to conceal it. Eliza, in particular, spoke with an unsettling casualness about things she should not have known. Esther, though quieter, carried herself with a gravity that suggested she too bore knowledge unfit for childhood. In his journal, Pratt recorded a chilling observation when they slept in our guest chamber. I passed by the door at midnight and heard them whispering in unison, though the rhythm was too measured to be natural. It sounded less like play and more like a recitation, as if they repeated words taught to them by unseen instructors. Nathaniel himself did not escape scrutiny. Villagers noted his gaunt figure pacing outside at night, muttering prayers into the wind. Some believed he feared his daughter's powers as much as others did. There are even reports that he carried within his satchel not only a Bible, but also a small bundle of charms, scraps of scripture, dried herbs, and a lock of Margaret's hair tokens of both faith and superstition. It is in this fragile portrait that the seeds of Coldwater Hollow's unraveling were sown. A weary preacher convinced his daughters were both punishment and blessing. Two twins bound by secrets no child should carry, and a community so isolated and so pious that the revelation of hidden truths would strike it like lightning against dry timber. As Pratt concluded his entry for November 16, 1827, the man is haunted, the children are burdened, and the valley itself waits like a tinderbox. If the Lord has brought them here, it is not for comfort, but for judgment. The judgment, however, would come not from the heavens, but from the mouths of Eliza and Esther, two fragile vessels through which the dead would soon speak. Coldwater Hollow in 1827 was less a town than a fragile clearing carved into the wilderness. Surrounded on all sides by dense oak and hemlock forests, the settlement clung to a narrow valley cut by a stream whose waters ran black in the moonlight. Only about 200 souls called it home, most of them kin by blood or marriage. To outsiders, it was a place invisible to maps. Yet, to those who lived there, it was a world unto itself, a sanctuary against persecution, but also a prison built from secrecy. The founding of the Hollow traced back to 1812 when three families, disillusioned by denominational quarrels in Knoxville, pushed deeper into the Appalachians seeking a purer expression of Baptist faith. They erected cabins with their own hands, felled timber for a rough-hewn meeting house, and promised to live by Scripture untainted by the compromises of larger towns. But isolation carries its own dangers. Over the years, Coldwater Hollow became rigid, enforcing strict moral codes that punished deviation as sin. At the settlement center stood its church, a structure of pine logs weathered gray by storms. Though modest, it was the anchor of the community, its pulpit the throne of judgment. Its pews the theater of whispered suspicion. Attached to its eastern side was a small cemetery, rows of crude headstones marking both the honored dead and those whose deaths carried darker rumors. The man presiding over this flock was Pastor Samuel Pratt, a figure whose presence dominates the surviving accounts. Pratt had not been born in the Hollow. He had left a comfortable apprenticeship in Lexington to shepherd what he called God's wilderness sheep. Contemporary descriptions portray him as a meticulous, almost obsessive man. He kept records of every baptism, marriage, birth, and death, storing them in a cedar chest behind the pulpit. He also recorded his private thoughts in a personal journal entries that would one day become the key to unraveling the truth of what occurred during the Harlows' visit. Pratt's sense of duty bordered on paranoia. He believed himself guardian not only of souls, but also of history itself, charged with documenting God's work in this isolated valley. His handwriting was cramped, his sentences often rigidly precise, but between the lines one glimpses a man deeply uneasy, as though he sensed that beneath the surface piety of Coldwater Hollow lay something unclean. This place, he wrote in the summer of 1827, appears righteous, but breathes as though the earth itself resents us. The hills watch, and the stones remember. Daily life in Coldwater Hollow revolved around labor and prayer. Men worked the thin soil, women tended gardens, and children were expected to memorize scripture as soon as they could read. Laughter existed, but it was hushed, as though joy itself might be mistaken for indulgence. Disputes between families were settled less by law than by the weight of collective judgment on Sunday mornings. And always, the church stood at the center. Its bell a constant reminder that God's eye missed nothing. But Pratt knew the community's cohesion came at a cost. In his journal, he noted that gossip served as both glue and weapon. "We bind ourselves by knowing each other's sins," he observed. "Confession is demanded not for absolution, but for surveillance." Behind every act of piety lurked fear, the fear of exposure, the fear of ostracism, the fear that one's private shame might be dragged into the open. Into this atmosphere came the Harlow twins, whose very presence threatened the delicate balance. Their ability to speak hidden truths out loud struck at the community's unspoken pact: sins might be tolerated so long as they remained hidden. Pratt sensed the danger immediately. On their first night in his home, after Eliza revealed the long-past blight on his wife's roses, he wrote, "The child's words shook my household. My wife wept. My spirit quailed. If they speak such matters before the congregation, the walls of this place will fall." The hollow itself was already haunted by rumor. For years, travelers passing through the valley had vanished, their disappearances attributed to wild animals or the merciless elements, though no proof had ever surfaced. Whispers persisted that the settlement's prosperity had come too quickly for such poor soil. Some muttered that the earliest families had found treasure, though what form that treasure took was never clarified. Pratt, meticulous as ever, noted the pattern but dared not probe further. The children of Coldwater Hollow, too, carried scars. Many had lost parents to harsh winters or accidents in the hills. Some bore physical deformities whispered about in secret the Lord's curse, villagers said, though others hinted at bloodlines too closely entangled. Pratt, though devout, recorded his unease. The hollow is closed upon itself like a snake devouring its tail. Our children bear the mark of this enclosure, and I fear what future such a people may have. Against this backdrop, the arrival of the Harlows was like a spark falling on dry tinder. Nathaniel Harlow, worn from years of wandering, was a familiar type, a circuit preacher bringing spiritual renewal to forgotten congregations. Such men came and went. But his daughters were something altogether different. Pratt's language grows frantic when describing them. They regard us as though already knowing our secrets. It is not innocence but judgment in their eyes. Over the following days, this judgment would become undeniable. But even in the early hours of their stay, Pratt sensed the foundation of his community trembling. He had hidden a whiskey bottle beneath the floorboards of his own church, a private shame, when the twins revealed its exact location and even the cloth that wrapped it. Pratt realized the safety of secrecy no longer existed. If they could pierce his soul so easily, what of others? What of the entire hollow? The church's very timbers seemed to creak under the weight of anticipation. Families whispered that the girls looked familiar, though none had met them before. Children claimed to hear them speaking in the night in voices not their own. Esther, the quieter twin, was often seen staring into the cemetery, lips moving as though in silent conversation. Pratt closed his entry for November 17th with words that ring like prophecy. "I have long guarded this flock against wolves without. Now I perceive a different danger lambs who speak with the tongues of the dead. If the Lord sent them, then judgment is at hand. And if not the Lord, then some darker power has chosen our hollow for its stage." Coldwater Hollow, a community bound by silence, was about to be shattered by voices it could neither deny nor explain. By the second night of their stay, the atmosphere in Coldwater Hollow had shifted from cautious hospitality to an undercurrent of dread. Families who had welcomed the Harlows with the customary bread and salt now whispered in their cabins after dark, debating whether the twins were holy instruments or harbingers of something unclean for those present in Pastor Pratt's house. However, the matter was no longer in doubt. The girls saw too much. That evening, as rain lashed against the wooden shutters, Nathaniel Harlow confessed that his daughters often dreamed of the places they visited. It began when they were infants. He explained in a voice as weary as the firelight. At first, I thought it childish imagination. They would wake with tears and speak names they could not know. But their words proved true. Always true. No sooner had he finished than Eliza stepped forward from the shadows, her hair damp from sleep, her eyes disturbingly alert. "Pastor," she said, fixing Pratt with a gaze that felt more like interrogation than a child's curiosity. Beneath the third board from the altar, "You keep something that should not be there." Pratt's heart nearly failed. No one in the hollow, not even his wife, knew of the bottle hidden there, swaddled in the remains of his infant son's blue blanket. It was a secret he had intended to carry to his grave. The physical embodiment of his shame, his weakness for whiskey, his failure as both pastor and father. Before he could stammer a response, Esther emerged behind her sister, whispering with eerie certainty, "The cloth is blue." The pastor collapsed into his chair, his face pale as bone. Later in his journal, he would admit it was not accusation, but revelation. They did not guess they knew. Their words pressed upon me like scripture engraved in stone. Word of this first revelation spread faster than wildfire. By morning, half the hollow knew that something uncanny had occurred in Pratt's home. Some dismissed it as trickery, others as coincidence. But the unease deepened when, during Sunday service, the twins began to address the congregation directly. Nathaniel had delivered a sermon of repentance, the kind expected of a traveling preacher. Yet, as the final hymn faded, Eliza slipped from her pew and approached Mr. Samuel Carter, a prosperous farmer whose reputation rested on generosity to the church. Looking up at him with piercing innocence, she asked, "Does it still count as stealing if you plan to give it back?" The man blanched. For 6 months he had been skimming coins from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed land purchase. He had sworn to replace every penny once his fortunes improved. Yet no soul knew of his theft until that moment. Before the congregation could stir, Esther turned her gaze toward Mrs. Lydia Grant, the Hollow's sternest widow. "Your husband didn't die in the hunting accident, did he? He ran away, and you hide his letters." The elderly woman nearly fainted. She had indeed invented her husband's death 16 years earlier after he abandoned her. Ashamed to admit the truth, the letters' pleas for forgiveness from Missouri were hidden in a trunk beneath her bed. From pew to pew, the children moved like somber angels, speaking secrets with a calm detachment that made their words all the more horrifying. To Dr. Amos Hale, they whispered of patients who perished because his medical training had been forged from lies. To the Miller family, they revealed the presence of a hidden son simple-minded, kept in an attic out of shame. To young Thomas Blair, they described his midnight trysts with a married woman whose husband often traveled for trade. Each revelation fell like a stone into the still waters of the congregation, rippling outward until the entire room vibrated with terror. These were not vague accusations, but intimate details, phrases only the guilty themselves would recognize. Pratt, standing dumbstruck at the pulpit, described the moment as a vision of Judgment Day delivered not by angels, but by children's mouths. And yet, it was the final declaration that froze every breath in the sanctuary. Eliza placed her hand upon the altar, her small fingers brushing the wooden cross carved by the Hollow's founders. Her voice rang clear. "This ground is stained. The Whitaker family did not perish in a house fire. As you say, they died here, in this very room, and some among you know why." The silence was suffocating. Faces drained of color. The Whitakers, Jacob, his wife Anne, and their twin daughters had been the settlement's darlings in its earliest years. Official records claimed they burned in a winter fire of 1811. Their graves lay marked in the cemetery. But those who had lived through that time felt their stomachs twist. Elder Thomas Briggs, one of the original settlers, rose slowly, leaning on his cane. His voice trembled with age but carried authority. "Child, you speak of things no one has told. How could you know such matters?" Eliza did not flinch. Anne Whitaker wore a silver locket with her mother's hair inside. Jacob carved a doll for their daughter Mary, who never went anywhere without it. The night they died, the girls were dressed in blue. They came to this church for sanctuary, but they were not safe. Gasps broke through the crowd. Every detail matched whispered memories: the locket, the doll, the dresses. Esther added softly, "They cried behind the altar, but the ones they trusted most betrayed them." In his journal, Pratt captured his horror. The very walls seemed to echo with their words. It was as if the floorboards themselves remembered the blood spilled upon them. I looked upon my flock and saw terror in every face, for they recognized the truth. Secrets buried for 16 years now spoke with children's voices. The congregation erupted into whispers. Some insisted the girls were touched by God, others that they were possessed. But no one could deny the precision of their knowledge. The Hollow, bound together by silence and complicity, was unraveling before its own altar. That night, Pastor Pratt could not sleep. He walked the perimeter of the church, listening to the wind howl through the boards. Yet the sound was not wind at all. It was the faint echo of children crying. Coldwater Hollow, once united by fear of exposure, now faced a greater fear that the dead themselves had found tongues, and those tongues belonged to 2 9-year-old girls who dreamed in darkness. The Sunday that followed would be remembered by the people of Coldwater Hollow, not as a day of worship, but as the day their carefully woven fabric of silence was ripped apart. From the first toll of the cracked church bell, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the valley itself anticipated what was about to occur. The pews filled slowly, each family entering with the solemnity of mourners rather than parishioners. Some came out of duty, others out of curiosity, and still more because they feared what might be revealed in their absence. Reverend Nathaniel Harlow delivered the sermon with the fervor of a man desperate to call his audience to repentance. He spoke of hidden sins, of the futility of concealment before the eyes of God, and of the urgency of confession before judgment. His voice cracked with emotion, yet the congregation listened with guarded hearts, aware that the true source of unease sat quietly in the front pew, Eliza and Esther, their small faces expressionless, their eyes roaming the sanctuary as if reading invisible inscriptions on the souls around them. When the hymns faded and the final prayer was spoken, the congregation expected dismissal. Instead, the twins rose. They did not move toward the door like other children, but toward the pews themselves, drifting among the families with a calmness that was almost unbearable. Pratt wrote in his journal, "I felt as though time itself had halted, waiting for their words. Every heart beat louder than the hymn just sung. The first revelation came as Eliza approached Samuel Carter, the wealthy farmer already shaken by her earlier question. She stood before him and said in a voice as clear as a bell, "Mr. Carter, the coins you have taken from God's plate will not ruin you if you return them. But if you keep them, they will bury you." The man's face drained of blood. Murmurs spread. Only days earlier she had spoken of his theft. Now she named it as sin. Carter bowed his head. unable to meet the gaze of his neighbors. Before the silence could settle, Esther turned to Mrs. Lydia Grant. "You still keep his letters," she whispered, audible to all. "Every word he wrote from Missouri. You told your children their father died beneath a tree. But his heart still beats." Gasps echoed through the church. Lydia Grant's eyes brimmed with tears. For 16 years she had maintained the lie of widowhood to protect her dignity, hiding the truth of her husband's abandonment. Now, in a moment, the illusion collapsed. The twins moved methodically, their words falling like hammer blows. To Dr. Amos Hale, they spoke of patients lost because of his false training. To the Miller family, they mentioned the attic door where their hidden son lived in shame. To Thomas Blair, they described the scar on his lover's shoulder, something no child could possibly know. Each statement was delivered not with cruelty but with a strange detachment, as if the girls were merely instruments through which truth flowed. The congregation sat paralyzed. Some wept, some prayed aloud. Others stared in mute horror, unwilling to accept but unable to deny the accuracy of what they were hearing. Pastor Pratt himself felt as though the sanctuary had transformed into a courtroom, each secret exposed like evidence before an unseen judge. He confessed in his journal the children's voices did not sound like voices at all, but like the turning of pages in a book long sealed. They recited what ought never to have been written. Then came the revelation that tore through the hollow like lightning. Eliza, her face pale but resolute, walked to the front of the church. She placed her hand upon the wooden cross above the altar. Her eyes seemed far older than her years. "This ground is not clean," she said, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. "The Whitaker family did not die in a fire. They died here in this very room, and some among you carry the weight of knowing why." The effect was immediate. A wave of whispers erupted, then stopped as though choked off by fear. The Whitakers, Jacob, his wife Anne, and their twin daughters, Mary and Ruth, had perished 16 years earlier in what was said to be a cabin fire. They had been mourned, buried, and remembered as victims of misfortune. Yet older members of the congregation froze at the mention of their names, their eyes betraying a knowledge long buried. Elder Thomas Briggs, his cane rattling against the floor, rose, trembling. "Child," he said hoarsely, "you speak of things you cannot know. How dare you bring such torment into this house of God?" But Eliza did not falter. She listed details no living outsider could have known: Anne's silver locket with her mother's hair, Jacob's carved wooden doll for Mary, Ruth's blue dress she wore that night. Esther's voice followed. Soft as a funeral hymn, they cried behind this altar. They begged for sanctuary, but sanctuary was denied. The room seemed to collapse inward. Mothers clutched their children. Men stared at the floor. A groan of anguish rose from the back pew, though no one could tell from whose lips. Pratt's own knees weakened. He remembered faint traces conversations that had ceased when he entered a room, the unmarked patch of cemetery soil where flowers appeared without explanation, the hush that fell whenever the Whitaker name arose. Now, in the mouths of 2 9-year-olds, the unspeakable had been spoken. The church dissolved into chaos. Some screamed accusations. Others demanded silence. A handful fell to their knees in desperate prayer. Pratt himself rang the bell wildly, hoping to restore order, but the sound only heightened the frenzy. It was as if the dead themselves had joined us, he later wrote, and every soul in that sanctuary knew they were guilty of listening in silence for too long. That night, the hollow was no longer the same. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Secrets, once buried, now pulsed like open wounds. The Whitakers' ghostly presence seemed to hover in every corner, a reminder that the past would not stay silent. And at the center of it all were the Harlow twins, who had spoken without malice yet shattered an entire community. For them, truth was not choice but compulsion, dreams given shape in daylight. As Esther explained softly before leaving the church that night, we do not choose what we see. The dreams choose us. In Coldwater Hollow, the dreams had begun to speak louder than the sermons. The revelation about the Whitaker family struck Coldwater Hollow like a thunderclap that refused to fade. In the stunned silence following the twins' declaration, it seemed even the candle flames bent backward, as though recoiling from words too heavy for children's mouths. For 16 years, the Hollow had lived under the official story that on a storm-struck December night in 1811, the Whitaker cabin had gone up in flames, consuming Jacob, Anne, and their daughters, Mary and Ruth. The records were neat, the graves marked, the mourning proper. But all who had lived through that winter knew there were inconsistencies, details quietly ignored. Questions never asked aloud. Now, in 1827, those details clawed their way back into the light. Eliza's voice had carried the precision of a court deposition. She had named Anne's silver locket, Jacob's wooden doll, Ruth's blue dress. These were not vague insinuations but artifacts of memory, buried with the dead and never spoken of beyond a whisper. And when Esther added, almost inaudibly, "They cried behind the altar," the church itself seemed to groan with the weight of its hidden history. Elder Briggs tried to rally the congregation with denial. Leaning on his cane, he declared in a voice shaking more with fear than age, "These are the fancies of children, dreams woven into lies. We know the Whitakers burned. We buried their ashes with our own hands." But no sooner had he spoken than others began to murmur. Sarah McKinley, who as a girl had helped carry water buckets that night, whispered that the cabin fire had burned too quickly, as though started from within. Jonas Hale, a farmer then in his 20s, recalled that Jacob's tools, anvils, tongs, the great hammer of his trade had been missing from the ruins, as though carried away before the blaze. And then there was the matter of the blood. For years, women of the Hollow had scrubbed at faint stains near the altar's baseboards, stains that always returned no matter how thoroughly they cleaned. They had called it iron seeping from nails, or perhaps mildew. But now, confronted with the twins' words, none could shake the conviction that it was something far darker. Pratt, trembling behind the pulpit, tried to quiet the growing unrest. He begged the congregation to remain still, to pray for discernment. Yet even as he spoke, his mind reeled with fragments he had long tried to dismiss, flowers placed on unmarked soil in the cemetery. Odd gaps in the old pastor's records, the unspoken hush that always followed mention of the Whitakers. He wrote later, when the child spoke, it was as if 1,000 unvoiced suspicions leapt into the open, screaming at once. The Hollow's older families exchanged glances heavy with complicity. Some clutched their walking sticks so tightly their knuckles whitened. Others looked at the ground, unwilling to meet their neighbors' eyes. The younger folk, those who had only heard rumors, watched with mounting dread, realizing that their elders' silence might not have been ignorance, but agreement. It was Rebecca Turner, a widow, who finally broke the silence with a quavering voice. "I saw them," she whispered. "That night, not in the fire. They were running to the church. I was fetching water, and I saw Anne clutching the girl's hands. I never spoke of it, for I was told I had imagined it, but I swear before God, they came here seeking sanctuary." The room erupted. Shouts of blasphemy collided with cries of truth. Families turned against one another. Pratt rang the bell again and again, the clamor echoing like judgment through the rafters, until at last the voices died down into a fearful hush. Eliza, standing at the altar, did not weep or tremble. Instead, She lifted her small hand toward the rafters as though tracing something unseen. "They never left this place," she said. "Their voices still sing, though none of you dare to hear, and the ones who silenced them have carried the burden every night since." All eyes turned to Elder Briggs, whose face had turned the color of ash. He tried to speak but faltered, collapsing back into his pew. Others, Elder Thompson, Martha Givens. Isaac Perry shifted uneasily, as though waiting for accusations that had not yet come. Their silence was louder than denial. That night, after the congregation stumbled home in fear, Pratt sat alone in the sanctuary. He recorded every detail in his journal by trembling candlelight. He confessed to hearing faint whispers in the rafters, like children reciting hymns long forgotten. "If stone remembers," he wrote, "then these walls have not forgotten. And if heaven demands witness, perhaps these little ones are its chosen scribes." The story of the Whitakers spread through the hollow like plague. Neighbors whispered in doorways, speculating who had been complicit. Mothers pulled their children close, muttering prayers against curses. Men checked their doors twice before sleep, fearing not bandits or wolves, but ghosts returning for vengeance, and but the twins did not speak further that night. They lay quietly in their narrow beds, eyes open in the dark. According to Nathaniel, they had both murmured the same words before drifting into uneasy sleep. The fire was never real. The cries are still here. The Hollow had long prided itself on unity, but unity built on silence is brittle. The revelation fractured that unity into shards. The question was no longer whether the Whitakers had died in fire or in blood, but who among the living had helped lay their voices to rest beneath the sanctuary floor. And the answer, though still unspoken, lingered heavy in the valley air, an answer the Harlow twins seemed determined to drag into the light, no matter the cost. The night after the service collapsed into chaos. Pastor Samuel Pratt could not rest. The Hollow lay in uneasy silence. Cabins dark, except for the occasional flicker of lanterns, where families whispered late into the hours. Yet, in the pastor's parsonage, candlelight burned until nearly dawn. Pratt's hands trembled as he sifted through the cedar chest of church records, searching for what he had long avoided, the truth about the Whitaker family. For years, he had ignored the oddities in the official documentation. The entry for the Whitakers' supposed deaths was uncharacteristically brief. His predecessor, Pastor Elias Rowe, had been meticulous in his notes, recording births, accidents, even the faintest illnesses in painstaking detail. But in December of 1811, when the Whitakers were said to have perished, Rowe's record contained only a single, chilling line, "perished in fire," laid to rest with proper ceremony. Pratt had always dismissed the sparseness as grief, perhaps fatigue, yet now, in light of the Harlow twins' revelations, he felt the absence like a gaping wound. He rummaged deeper into the chest, beneath faded marriage certificates and brittle baptism registers, until his hand struck something small and leather-bound. It was a journal, water-stained, the cover warped, its binding loose. The handwriting inside was Rowe's, but these were not public records. These were private thoughts, never meant for the congregation's eyes. Pratt read by the guttering light of a single candle, his pulse hammering louder with every page. Rowe's words painted a picture far different from the Hollow's official story. He described Jacob Whitaker as a man of integrity, known for his skill at the forge, but also for his uncompromising honesty. In the months before his death, Jacob had become suspicious of certain community leaders. Rowe noted accounts that do not tally and funds for building unaccounted. There were whispers of wealth entering the Hollow, far greater than the meager harvest could produce. Jacob, it seemed, had threatened to expose the truth. Then came the entry for the night of December 21st, 1811. Rowe wrote of being roused from sleep by voices raised in the church. He had gone to the door but stopped short, hearing names spoken in anger: Jacob, Anne, the children, accusations, threats, pleas. He did not enter, but from outside he heard the children crying. Then silence. Roe scrawled. When morning came, I saw them no more. The others said a fire had taken them, but I saw no fire, only smoke rising from the church itself. The Lord forgive us for what we allowed. Pratt's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled so violently the candle nearly toppled. Roe's final entry sealed the horror: they lie here. Not in the earth, not in the ashes of a cabin. They lies within these walls. I agreed to silence for the sake of the flock, but my soul is burdened beyond measure. May God have mercy on all of us. The implications were staggering. The Whitakers had not died in their cabin. They had sought sanctuary in the church, only to be murdered within its walls. Their remains, if Roe's words were to be believed, had been concealed in the very foundation of the sanctuary itself. For 16 years, the people of Coldwater Hollow had worshipped, prayed, and broken bread upon the bones of the innocent. Pratt staggered to his feet, clutching the journal. He felt as though the ground beneath him shifted, as though the very boards groaned with the weight of accusation. The floor remembers, he whispered to himself. Every hymn, every prayer, all spoken over blood. At dawn, he confronted Nathaniel Harlow. The traveling preacher listened in silence as Pratt read the passages aloud. His face did not betray surprise, only a weary resignation. I have seen this before, Nathaniel murmured, in other towns, other sanctuaries. My daughters do not conjure knowledge, they inherit it. The dead cling to them until they are heard. When asked how such innocence could bear such weight, Nathaniel looked at his sleeping daughters, curled together in uneasy dreams. Because no one else will listen, he said. That morning, Pratt called a gathering of the elders, placing Roe's journal upon the pulpit. He read aloud the damning words. The room grew colder with each sentence. Elder Briggs tried to dismiss it as the delirium of an old man, but others paled, exchanging glances that spoke of long-buried complicity. The younger men shifted uneasily, realizing for the first time that the foundations of their homes, their very church, might have been built not upon faith, but upon murder. One woman fainted when Pratt repeated the line, "They lie here." It was Eliza who ended the meeting. She entered silently, Esther at her side, their hair still tousled from sleep. Without prompting, she walked to the altar and pressed her palm against the floorboards. "He's telling the truth," she said softly. "We can hear them." "Every night, they never rest," Esther added, her voice barely above a whisper. "They dream with us. They show us what happened." Panic rippled through the congregation. Some fled the church in tears. Others demanded excavation of the floor. A few shouted that the children were possessed and should be cast out at once. But the weight of Roe's journal, coupled with the uncanny accuracy of the twins' visions, left little room for dismissal. That evening, Pratt sealed the journal in his own chest, but the words burned in his mind. He described his state in his next entry. "I feel I stand on the edge of revelation so vast it will destroy us. If we tear open these boards, we may uncover bones, but we will also uncover the truth of what we have become. Are we a congregation? Or are we a company of murderers clothed in hymns?" The hollow could no longer contain its secrets. The dead demanded to be heard, and through the mouths of two frail children. They would not be silenced. By the third morning of the Harlow stay, Coldwater Hollow had become a settlement on the brink of collapse. Whispers of the Whitaker murders spread from cabin to cabin, setting neighbor against neighbor. Children were kept indoors. Women avoided the church, and the men of the valley eyed one another with suspicion, Yet the most decisive blow came not from within, but from the outside. Near midday, a lone rider appeared on the eastern trail. He was not a backwoods settler, but a man of the town, dressed in a tailored coat and riding a horse too fine for mountain roads. Introducing himself as Mr. Jonathan Keene, a solicitor from Nashville, he explained that he was investigating the estate of a missing merchant named Edward Langford, last seen traveling toward this valley 16 years earlier. Among Langford's effects was correspondence hinting at business dealings with families in Coldwater Hollow. Pastor Pratt welcomed him with brittle courtesy, though inside he felt the chill of providence or perhaps judgment, for in Rowe's hidden journal, Langford's name had been listed among the travelers who disappeared in 1811. Pratt recorded in his diary, "The Lord sends witnesses not of heaven but of earth. The walls of this hollow tighten. Truth presses upon us from every side." When Mr. Keene was introduced to the Harlows, Eliza fixed him with her unsettling gaze. Before Pratt could speak, she said with disarming certainty, "Mr." Langford carried a gold watch. It cracked when he fell from his horse. "His things are buried behind the church." Keene staggered. The watch had indeed been mentioned in Langford's personal letters engraved with his initials, cracked across the crystal. No one outside the family should have known. How could this child, he began, but Eliza had already turned away, as if the matter required no further explanation. Esther, quiet and pale, added, "The bridle is there too." Elder Thompson placed it in the earth. The solicitor demanded excavation at once. A crowd gathered behind the church as men took up shovels, their faces pale with dread. Pratt himself joined, his heart thudding like a funeral drum. With every stroke of earth, he half expected the ground to wail. Within the hour, the spade of young Jacob Miller struck metal. A tarnished watch emerged from the soil, its cracked crystal catching the weak sunlight. Alongside it lay a rotted leather bag and fragments of tack, Langford's possessions, hidden exactly where the twins had said. The effect upon the crowd was electric. Gasps, cries, and shouts of accusation rang out. Keene held the watch aloft, his voice firm. "This matches the description precisely. There can be no doubt. Your hollow has harbored the evidence of murder for 16 years. All eyes turned to Elder Thompson, one of the oldest men in the community. His face, lined with age, now twisted in guilt. Eliza stepped closer, her voice gentle but merciless. "The dreams stopped after that first year, didn't they? You told yourself God had forgiven you, but He didn't. They only grew quieter because you buried them." Thompson broke. His cane fell to the ground as he sank onto a stump, sobbing openly. "It was never meant to happen," he moaned. "We needed the money. Winter was upon us. Our children starving." He fought back. Langford fought, and in the struggle he fell. "We buried what we could. God help me. We buried more than gold." The confession ripped through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Women shrieked, men cursed, some wept. Keene demanded names. Who had conspired? Who else was buried? Thompson's answer was barely audible. There were others. Langford was not the first, and he was not the last. "We built this hollow on their coin." Pratt, his voice trembling, cried out, and the Whitakers was their blood spilled for the same reason. Thompson's silence was answer enough. His eyes, hollow and broken, drifted toward the church as if seeing ghosts at its windows. That night, Pratt's journal reads like the testimony of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. "We uncovered not only the watch, but our very souls. The hollow is guilty. The elders are guilty. And I, for holding my silence, am guilty too. The children are not witches. They are witnesses, witnesses for the dead." The solicitor wasted no time. He rode for the county seat, promising to return with authorities. But even before law arrived, the hollow had already begun to crumble. Families accused one another in the lanes. Voices rose in violence, and elders who had carried secrets for decades could no longer bear their weight. Eliza and Esther, sitting quietly outside their father's lodging, watched with eyes too knowing for children. "We don't choose what we see," Eliza murmured. "They show us. They make us speak," Esther added, her tone almost a plea. "The Whitaker girls want someone to remember them. That's all. To remember the truth." For the first time, Pratt felt he understood. These children were not heralds of doom, but instruments of memory, the voice of the past refusing to be silenced. And yet, he could not escape the dread that their burden was only beginning. Coldwater Hollow, once bound by silence, now echoed with confessions that could no longer be buried. The watch had been found. The elders had broken, and the dead were not finished speaking. The arrival of the county authorities was swifter than anyone in Coldwater Hollow expected. Word of Mr. Keene's discovery, the cracked gold watch, the buried bridle, the trembling confession of Elder Thompson had traveled down the mountain trails like a contagion. Within 3 days, the settlement found itself host to a county sheriff, a federal marshal, and Judge Silas Harlan, a stern man whose silver hair and iron posture lent him the aspect of biblical retribution. The makeshift court was held in the only building large enough to contain the entire congregation, the church itself. For the first time in its 16-year history, the sanctuary was not a place of worship but of reckoning. Benches that once bore bowed heads now held pale faces twisted in fear. The wooden cross above the altar loomed as a silent witness to the proceedings. At the front sat Elder Thompson, along with Marcus Perry and Samuel Bradford, 2 other men named in his faltering confession. All 3 were shackled, their shoulders bent not merely by age but by the unbearable weight of guilt. Judge Harlan opened with a voice like stone grinding against stone. "These proceedings will determine not only the guilt of these men, but the truth of this place. Evidence has been found buried in your soil. Witnesses, though children, have spoken with uncanny precision, and confessions have already begun. The Almighty may forgive, but this court will not ignore." The atmosphere was electric with dread. Some villagers clung to the hope that denial might still preserve their community. Others whispered prayers for mercy, knowing the tide of revelation could not be turned back. The testimony began with Mr. Keene, who presented the recovered artifacts, the tarnished watch, the rotted bridle, the remnants of the money bag. He detailed how the watch matched Langford's correspondence exactly. The judge nodded gravely. This proves beyond dispute that Mr. Langford met his end here. The question is, how many others shared his fate? Then the twins were called. Rebecca and Rachel in the original account. Here Eliza and Esther Harlow stood, dwarfed by the weight of every eye upon them. Judge Harlan, skeptical but compelled, asked children, "Tell us how you knew of these things." Eliza spoke without hesitation. "We dreamed them. We see the ones who were taken. Mr. Langford showed us his watch. He wanted someone to find it," Esther added, her soft voice carrying eerily through the rafters. "He is not alone. There were others. They come to us at night. They want to be remembered." The crowd stirred uneasily. A woman sobbed aloud when pressed for details. The girls recited names and descriptions with unnerving accuracy. Joshua Patterson, a surveyor with a silver ring; William Morse, a merchant with a knife engraved at the hilt; Reverend Robert Chen, a traveling minister whose copper cross was buried with him. Each item would later be found during excavation beneath the very floor of the church. But even in this moment, the specificity chilled the assembly. It was Elder Thompson, breaking down completely, who confirmed their words. He rose shakily, his chains rattling, and cried out, "It is true, all of it. 11 men over 3 winters. We told ourselves it was survival, that their coin would build our homes, feed our children. But greed carried us further. And when Jacob Whitaker threatened to expose us, we silenced him, his wife, his little girls. Lord, forgive me. We silenced them in this very room. The confession sent a wave of horror through the congregation. Women screamed. Men buried their faces in their hands. The Hollow's deepest secret was now undeniable. The settlement had been founded not on faith, but on murder and theft. Judge Harlan's voice cut through the chaos. You admit to the murder of the Whitaker family and 11 travelers. Yes, Thompson whispered, tears streaming, and more than murder. Anne was with child. Twins, the doctor said. We killed them too, though they had not yet breathed. 4 children, 4 souls cry out from beneath these boards. The words silenced the room into suffocating stillness. Even the marshal at the back crossed himself. It was then that Esther, her small frame trembling, spoke what would haunt the court for years to come. They are still here. The Whitaker girls, the unborn twins. They sing to us when the lanterns burn low. They will not rest until their names are spoken and their graves are made. The theological weight of such a statement was staggering. To the devout of the Hollow, the idea that unborn children could demand justice was almost unbearable. Doctor, hail. The community's unlicensed physician stammered that he had seen signs of Anne's pregnancy during burial but had been forced to silence. We told ourselves they were too young for souls, he confessed. But God has proven us liars. The trial continued into the night. Witness after witness rose, reluctantly confirming pieces of the twins' visions, odd stains, strange sounds, whispered confessions half forgotten. Piece by piece, the facade of piety collapsed. By the time Judge Harlan delivered his summary, no one in the Hollow could cling to ignorance. This community, the judge declared, has been built on the proceeds of murder. Its elders are guilty not only of bloodshed but of corruption, conspiracy, and the profanation of holy ground. Justice demands that these men face the full measure of earthly law. Yet what strikes me most is that the revelations came not from investigation, but from the lips of children. Whether divine or unnatural, I cannot say. But truth has spoken, and it will not be silenced again. As the shackled elders were led away, the congregation sat hollow-eyed. Some wept openly. Others glared at the twins with fear and hatred, as though blaming them for tearing the veil away. Yet the girls only sat quietly, hands clasped, their eyes distant. That night, Pastor Pratt wrote, I thought I had seen the depth of our sin. I was wrong. The floor beneath my feet is grave and gallows both. The children are not judges, but scribes writing our damnation in words no hand can erase. The Hollow would never recover. The trial was not its end, but the beginning of dissolution. For once truth is spoken, silence can never be restored. The days following the trial marked the slow death of Coldwater Hollow. Judge Harlan had decreed that the settlement would be dissolved, its buildings dismantled, and the land returned to wilderness or sold to compensate the families of the murdered. For the villagers, who had poured 16 years of labor into carving lives out of stone and timber, the ruling was devastation. But for those who had heard the testimonies within the church, it was not simply legal ruin, it was the recognition that their entire existence had been founded upon innocent blood. The excavation of the church floor began at dawn, under the supervision of Sheriff Maynard and the marshal. Men pried up the planks that had held the congregation's prayers for more than a decade. Beneath the wood lay packed soil, dark and damp. It did not take long for spades to strike bone. 3 skeletons emerged first, tangled with fragments of clothing. With them lay unmistakable tokens, a silver ring engraved J. P. A knife with a decorated hilt, a copper cross still clinging to the decayed remains of its chain. Each matched precisely the descriptions the Harlow twins had spoken. The crowd gathered in horrified silence, watched as the past rose from the earth. Women wept. Men crossed themselves. Children clung to their mothers, too terrified to cry. Pratt recorded the moment in his journal. The church is no longer sanctuary but sepulchre. Each hymn we sang, each prayer we uttered resounded above these bones. We were not the flock of Christ, but keepers of a graveyard built upon lies. As more remains were uncovered, the scope of the crimes became undeniable. 11 men, merchants, preachers, surveyors, wanderers had been swallowed by the Hollow. And when Jacob Whitaker threatened to reveal the truth, his entire family had joined them. Buried not in marked graves, but within the foundations of the community itself. The Hollow disintegrated with startling speed. Families began abandoning their homes even before the final verdict. Some fled in the night, fearing retribution from the spirits of the dead. Others clung stubbornly to their cabins, insisting that what was done had been for survival, though even they knew the settlement's days were numbered. By the third week, Coldwater Hollow was half empty, its streets littered with broken possessions, and its church stripped of timbers to sell for restitution. But the most haunting presence remained the Harlow twins. Eliza and Esther spoke little after the excavation. They sat side by side in the cemetery at dusk, listening to something no one else could hear. When asked, Eliza replied, "The voices are quieter now. The Whitakers are resting." Yet Esther, her pale eyes staring into the darkened woods, whispered, "Not all of them. Some still wander." Judge Harlan's final report, later preserved in the Tennessee archives, reads with grim finality this community was born in secrecy, lived in deceit, and died in revelation. The evidence, both material and testimonial, leaves no room for doubt. What remains uncertain is the mechanism by which 2 children revealed what no living man could have known, whether divine, spectral, or otherwise. The result is the same truth rose from the grave, and justice, however incomplete, was served. For Pastor Pratt, the collapse of the Hollow was a personal crucifixion. His faith, once unshakable, had been pierced by the realization that he had ministered upon cursed ground. In his last surviving entry he wrote, "If God's house can be raised upon blood, then what is sacred, perhaps it is not the timbers, nor the altar, nor the cross. Perhaps it is only the cry of the innocent, demanding to be heard, that is truly holy." As for Nathaniel Harlow and his daughters, they departed quietly as they had arrived. Witnesses recalled seeing them walking down the valley road, Nathaniel's satchel slung across his shoulder, the twins holding each other's hands. A boy who followed them for a mile claimed he heard Esther murmur, "There will be other places, other voices," when asked what she meant. Eliza simply replied, "We don't choose. They find us." The Hollow was abandoned within a month. Its cabins fell to rot. Its fields returned to thistle and briar. By the time travelers passed through a year later, it was already a ghost settlement. But stories lingered. In Appalachian taverns and churchyards, people spoke of the valley where secrets bled into the soil, and of 2 girls who saw too much, heard too much, and carried the burden of the dead. Some dismissed the tale as frontier superstition, a morality play invented to warn against greed. Yet the documents remain Judge Harlan's proceedings, Sheriff Maynard's evidence, and above all, Pratt's journals, where every chilling detail was set down in a trembling hand. Even the skeptics could not explain away the accuracy of the twins' revelations, details of possessions, garments, and crimes no living witness had recorded. What became of Eliza and Esther remains uncertain. Some accounts place them years later in the hills of North Carolina, still accompanying their father on his preaching circuit, still uncovering long-buried sins in towns that had thought themselves safe. Others whisper that they vanished entirely in the 1840s, swallowed by the same wilderness that had birthed them, their fate as mysterious as their gift. But in Tennessee folklore, the story endures. Travelers speak of twin sisters, pale and solemn, who appear without warning in forgotten hamlets. They ask questions no child should ask, speak truths no stranger could know, and vanish before dawn. Those who encounter them say the same thing: the girls are not malicious. They simply carry voices that refuse to die. Coldwater Hollow itself is gone, its name erased from maps, its church dismantled board by board. Yet, beneath the soil, unmarked graves remain a reminder that silence cannot protect the guilty forever. Some truths, once spoken, echo across generations. And sometimes, the voices of the innocent choose the strangest vessels. 2 9-year-old girls whose burden was to remember what others tried so desperately to forget.